The most likely number of properties you'll have if you put your hand up and say, I'm a landlord, is 1. You let me know when institutions will be ready to own a street of terraces in Newcastle. Institutions don't like the uncertainty of managing an old creaking portfolio. I don't tend to look at other people's forecasts before I make my own. That's a methodology for forecasting well. Anybody who's done well building their business in the last 5 years, you should be ready for anything in the next 5.
Assuming you're a property developer, because why else would you be tuning into this podcast, and you're looking to become a better developer, then you won't want to miss our show this year. At our shows, you'll have the chance to listen to live expert speakers, network with like-minded professionals, and meet new service providers who can help you grow and perfect your property business. With Milton Keynes behind us, we're on to our next location in Bristol on the 30th of April, followed by Birmingham on the 16th of July, Manchester 10th of September, and finally, Leeds on the 8th of October. The show is created by developers, for developers, and the most amazing thing, tickets are completely free. Visit our website, propertydevelopershow.co.uk, to book your ticket today. Welcome to another episode of the Property Developer Show, the podcast. Today is a very special episode. It's episode 50. That doesn't include bonus episodes, by the way. But for episode 50, I've got the one and only Adam Lawrence. Adam is someone that I look to as a bit of an oracle of this industry. Amongst all the crap that goes on in the property space, I think, Adam, you are one of those individuals that people can look to really get a grasp on what goes on, and from an authentic perspective as well, no hidden agenda. And I just want to say personally, on behalf of the whole property industry, thank you very much for your input. That
is a fantastic compliment. I'm sure I'm only going to disappoint after that intro, Scott, but I really appreciate that. Thank you.
No, pleasure's all mine. So we'll start with the important question, I suppose. What is going on in the property industry at the moment? Property market, more so.
Market-wise, well, we've got the back end of a trappy market, really. Lots of people stuck with stuff that 2023 was a tough year for market pricing. So anyone who was developing stuff throughout that, they had a tough time because ultimately price inflation, construction price inflation, 40% probably, where general inflation was more like 25. And we all know those figures all feel a bit low when we compare the fact we're paying twice as much for stuff as we seem to used to be in 2019. Absolutely. So, there was a fair bit of stock there that either ended up getting held onto rather than sold. But it has a big knock-on effect on housing starts as well. So we're currently at the lowest starts in over 5 years, which includes obviously a bit of pandemic period, which isn't a great sign, especially if you're the government and you've said you're going to build 1.5 million homes, which was just a silly thing to say, really, wasn't it? So that's your sort of macro point of view. Your buy-to-let and your landlording, well, we've coped with normalisation to interest rates back to sort of where they've historically been, really. Perhaps arguably at the higher end of where they've been sort of post-2000. I don't take too much stock of what happened before about 2000 because the world did look quite different, far fewer people going to uni, far less participation in the workplace from females, all sorts of reasons why I dislike some of these graphs that go, oh, look what happened in 1980, whatever. It's like, yeah, but context is everything with data, So on that level, you've got, again, you've had to see yields. A lot of money has come north geographically because the yields in the south, especially the southeast, are not doing the business. That's meant disposals down there. And then you've got obviously regulatory pressure. You've got a largely anti-landlord government, although that doesn't really look any different from the last government, you could argue. And I think that would be quite fair. So you've got what they would have called, what Theresa May called a hostile environment, but a hostile environment for landlords. So it doesn't make people want to invest, but ultimately people have now got that choice as well. No effort, 4% maybe in the bank or in a bond, got tax to contend with. It's not going to set the world on fire. Will it keep pace with inflation? Who knows? But it's 4% instead of 1% or 0%. And that also changes things, because property is about risk and it's about reward, but it's also about effort. And also when time goes on, people get more scarred by a bad tenant and worse situations occur, and you seem to read about worse ones every day. Then you've got licensing and things on top, which is putting pressure on people who haven't necessarily looked after everything or had everything above board, let's say. And so you've got a pretty interesting environment where you've got more people trying to exit than you have trying to get in at the moment, as a brief synopsis.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that's creating a bit of a vacuum for shift in the market? Obviously, you've got the likes of Lloyd's, John Lewis, the big private equity firms that are looking towards getting into the UK market. Do you think it's going to move more away from sort of accidental landlords, sort of amateurish landlords, to more professional corporate sort of level?
It's such an interesting, we spend the whole podcast talking about that if you like, and I'd be quite happy to. But I think the thing about build to rent in general, institutional, is that there's lots of hands up for a nice block of flats in a suburb of Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, somewhere in London, etc., etc. They understand the yield. They've got a view they take from the market leaders in the industry, or the supposed market leaders in forecasting. On a 5-year, 10-year basis. They've got a build cost. They understand where they are. They see it as they've got an index-linked investment, which they like, inflation protection, and hopefully some capital growth over and above that. The difficulty with all of that model is when interest rates are 0 and you can do 3.5% yield, that looks okay. When interest rates are 4 and you can do 3.5% yield, it's a completely different kettle of fish. And then you've got affordability constraints and things like that. So institutions want to build lovely, shiny, ideally as big as possible. Build to rent needs real scale normally. They want, additional amenities, things that can really, differentiate from the rest of the market. And build to rent investments get underwritten at fairly fantastic rents when I see them. But then when you think the average build to rent is 7 years from conception to delivery, by the time you've had the 7 years, you're going to get there on the rental front probably. So they're not unreasonable. But when you let me know when institutions will be ready to own, and there are a couple of private equity backed places that do it, but want to own a street of terraces in Newcastle, which is how Granger started back in, I think it was 1918, and obviously now a public company, been public for decades, and they don't do that sort of stuff anymore. They do build to rent, they do freeholds, they do all sorts of stuff on the new build front and all the rest of it, but they've moved away from their older stock because institutions don't like the uncertainty of managing an old creaking portfolio. And it's not even that bit, it's just uncertainty. Because when does the roof need replacing? When do the windows need replacing? What's the real return from a secondary market investment? And when you're operating at that scale, can you get those delivered for $4,000 because you know the roofer and he's decent? Or are you realistically looking at more like using the BCIS calculator, which is going to tell you it's $9,000 or something like that, So difficult for them to work through those things. And I think there's a few pieces. I think there are bits in a jigsaw that can be placed into it, but I don't think they exist at the moment, so that they can have real certainty of income streams and know what they're buying and all the rest of it. So as I say, there's a couple of corporates doing it. There's probably more than a couple that I'm not aware of because they're doing it quite quietly, but they're clearly replacing, still the largest, the most likely number of properties you'll have if you put your hand up and say, I'm a landlord, is one at the moment. But that's getting, less and less commonplace, and you are seeing the average properties per landlord go up. Absolutely.
Do you think, obviously, the ripple effect of that happening is putting pressure on rent prices, which is obviously making it more unaffordable to rent? What from your perspective, where do you see this kind of evolving to?
Yeah, where does it end, sort of thing? Yeah. Well, I think affordability is always going to be a constraint. So there's some stuff in the press fairly recently about rents and affordability, and saying, rents are only up 1.5%, 2% this year. When they say that, they're talking about new rents, new to the market rents, rather than existing. Existing is probably best measured by the data set that the ONS use, and they're saying existing, last figures that were released a few weeks ago, 8.7%. That's existing and new blended together. So that means existing are going up over 10%. But this is because so many of them are so far off where the market rent was. So I think we've got to sort of put it into two boxes, really. Number one, as the interest rate normalises, there was always going to be an increase. Who's going to pay for it? 2/3 of the households in the country, homeowners, right? Roughly a third of them, it's about 35%, no mortgage. No problem. Inflation problems, energy bill problems, sure, right? But generally speaking, not a problem with their mortgage because they don't have one. The other half of the owner occupiers, so another third-ish, 30%, I think it is, they've got a problem, but they're on a fixed rate mortgage. So the problem comes one day, and when it comes, ouch, it really hurts. It's 100% increase or a 70% increase in their payments or whatever, depending on where in the cycle they were when they fixed it. And if they were dropping off a 1% mortgage, well done for getting it. Ouch, ouch when you came off, right? And then the tenants. So again, around about 50-50, still 19%. Most recent quoted figures are in the private rental sector, half encumbered, half unencumbered. Doesn't mean the unencumbered landlords didn't put their prices up. And again, for other reasons, such as insurance, contractors, legitimate to put the prices up. But if people were leveraged, and certainly if they were on floating rate mortgages, which they think about 1 million landlords were, when we had the old Liz Truss infamous budget in 2022, that I seem to never be able to go through a podcast or a supplement without talking about. But when that came, and you suddenly had a real big adjustment relatively overnight, both in the bond yields and in the base rate, climbing significantly afterwards as it did, it left people in a bit of a hole, and they suddenly hadn't put rents up for years. And so now it's got to go up 500 quid a month. Who can afford 500 quid a month? Not many tenants. The difference between a mortgage holder and a tenant is that the mortgage holder was scored at a stress test rate of 5.25% in 2021 or 5.5% before that. If they paid 1%, good luck to them. Small percentage of those people will use that extra money to overpay their mortgage. Most will have saved a bit and spent a lot in the real world. So it's not like they didn't have the money as far as affordability is calculated. And you would hope, a vast majority of them would, if it's a 5-year mortgage, would have progressed on in their careers, would have been getting paid more at that point in time, probably. Decent majority anyway. So they're not so badly off. Whereas when a tenant's credit scored to go into a property or affordability checked, depending on where you are in the country, depending on what multiples you use or your letting agent uses or whatever, they're not stress tested. Like, can they afford it today? Right. And so then if they were affordability scored 5 years ago to make a fair parallel with the mortgage market, then have they moved on in their job roles? Well, hopefully they're getting paid a bit more and all the rest of it. But suddenly an increase of 30%, 40%, 50% in the rents, how are they going to be able to afford it? They genuinely can't afford it. So affordability is your ceiling, and affordability already was stretched in London. And the way they've got round it, if you like, in London is they use different affordability metrics. And frankly, they squeeze more people into a property. Whereas out in the provinces where I've always sort of plied my trade, there's always been, historically, you'd see people who were single family unit, single person, got a relationship, got children, got an ex-relationship, and they might be able to have a 3-bedroom house. So the kids could come at the weekends. Bit of a luxury. Couple of empty bedrooms, 10 nights out of 14, let's say, right? But these days, that's just gone. So they're in a 1-bed and the kids got to sleep on the sofa if they come round to stay. So that's, or I don't know if we're already there quite as starkly as that, but that's where the journey goes. Over-occupation, much more demand for smaller units. The ONS have just adjusted their average house price in the UK down by 7.9% because of the price of houses that are actually transacting rather than the average price of a house, because these bigger and more expensive units are just staying in families, rarely transacting. And so there's much more, people will compromise much more on space than they would like to on location as a general rule. So they're buying cheaper stuff. And also perhaps the investors are buying cheaper stuff because of, again, the yield adjustment. So we had to have that yield adjustment to happen. And then there's, the supply and demand problem, which has always been somewhat problematic, but is looking really, really rough at the moment. So, of course, rents can't go up forever and they'll have to temper a little bit. On the flip side, minimum wage is up 6.7 this year. So utilities and rent are going to swallow all of that, right, generally speaking. But you look at the flip side of the coin. If you've got a minimum wage full-time working household now, 2 people, they're on nearly 50 grand a year. So we'd have laughed at that in 2019. So the world is different. We need to be careful not to navel gaze too much about nominal house prices, which is what the whole of the press spends all their time doing, much to my frustration that I don't mind telling people about.
Yeah. So I suppose just jumping back to what you said about the government 1.5 million houses.
Yeah.
Do you maybe think that was a kind of shoot for the stars, land on the moon type scenario, or do you think it's just so far out of reach to even get a percentage of that way?
Yeah, it can be both of those things, can't it, really? And I think if you look at the last however many governments, they've always said they're going to build all these homes. And it wasn't like the Conservatives didn't say they'd do 1.5 million homes. They were all saying it. They've all said it for multiple parliaments. They haven't been able to deliver it. The market is in charge of at least a million of those 1.5 million. And in Labour's fairly simple fag packet maths, I think, they were thinking maybe about 500,000 would come from social housing associations, local authorities. That was the plan, get local authorities building again. Because when we did build at scale post-World War II, where was a lot of housing coming from? It was coming from local authorities. The problem that they've got, again, is how much to build, and especially in some of these locations where it's going to cost them 250 grand to build it, right? And then it's going to be worth 150 grand. How does the economics of that get marketed? Well, you either cook the books, which is a very common thing at governmental level, and say, well, it's worth 250, but it doesn't really, we're into it for 250. And it doesn't matter what it's worth because we're not selling it and we don't have to. And to an extent, I get that, because if you then pitch that out in 50 years' time when they might want to sell that asset, it is going to be worth 250 or more, generally speaking. So there's a little bit of trickery there. But one of the other problems that there are in terms of the financing side is you've got some temporary accommodation blowing up, which is also bringing units out of the private rented sector in order to go to a housing provider, because the local authorities have shifted position from, I remember being at a meeting probably 12 or 13 years ago, and it was a very belligerent, aggressive, combative stance of, we'll take your property off you, we'll put a tenant in there, get on with it, see how you get on, local authority, local housing allowance rate. That conversation today at some councils who've sort of seen the light or have got big temporary accommodation problems is, we'll take it off you on an FRI lease. We'll do it for 5 years. We'll do all the work, all the management, all the rest of it, and we'll pay you market rent, not LHA. So huge increase in cost of doing that, but they're comparing it to a temporary accommodation bill where they might be paying double market rent to a provider in order to make that work, or certainly 50 or 70% more. So not easy. And whether it was naivety coming in or whether it's I like the, shoot for the moon, settle for the stars sort of argument, politically, people are so used to hearing it, and not a single voice in the industry has said that could be done. And then look at, flip side of the coin, go across the Atlantic and see Donald Trump says a lot of stuff and he doesn't even mean it like that. He doesn't mean it literally. He's just sort of starts a conversation quite aggressively, most people would agree, right? But he starts a conversation with these high-level statements, and then it gets the conversation going the way he wants it to go. He never meant it in the first place anyway. So there was I did see a correlation between Angela Rayner, who said, day one we'll get rid of Section 21, and you just read that and think, well, you won't, because Commons and the Lords doesn't work like that, right? And we all know that. And Angela Rayner knew that as well. And on day one, Donald Trump's going to do this, that and the other. Neither of them can do that. He did all his executive orders and all the rest of it, but realistically, it wasn't what he promised they were going to be. But you know where his crosshairs are. So they're focusing on building homes. There's a huge funding gap. If they start to justify that funding gap somehow by saying, well, hold on, because in 3 years' time, the spend on temporary accommodation is going to be worse than it is today, for example, if they then say, right, well, we need to do that differently. Yeah. So we're using some of this money. Now, the problem is sort of fiscal honesty, if you like, because how does that fit within the broader framework of the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves keeps banging on about? And it's kind of tweaked a little bit, but not changed massively, which is typical politics. Very few people come in and go, everything off the table, complete rework of stuff. It's mostly tweaking. So unless there's some fiscal honesty and some room within the rules to say, well, hold on, we've got overspends in councils here of this much. But in reality, we're kind of seeing this already, because you've got, I think, 23 councils who've raised council tax over 5%, and most of the rest have gone up 4.99 because that's what they need to do. Next year's not going to look any different. It's not, because temporary accommodation budget and some of the stuff that's the councils are sinking their money into is going up more than 5% a year. So they can't keep pace.
Absolutely.
And central government can't keep bailing them out.
No, it's interesting. I mean, the local council to me as well don't know how to invest money and spend money, so that's always a playing factor to budget and everything else.
And why would they? And this is where the devolution argument does make a bit of sense. Realistically, the reality behind it is it's a bit of an anti-Thatcherite sort of play, because the Thatcher era basically tried to neuter the local authority, whereas really what they're now looking at and finding, and there are some sensible bits in what Labour are saying, pension reform, bringing together tiny weeny pension companies, building much bigger ones, that does make sense because there's a lot of efficiency savings. Where I live, the local authorities that they're talking about combining, they're saying that will save 23 million a year just in having fewer councillors and fewer, moving parts that you don't need when you're amalgamated. It's a bit of a no-brainer.
Absolutely.
But having said that, does that then mean when you have a county council running or a combined authority running everything, that you suddenly get hedge fund or investment managers interested? No, you don't. It's not what they do. So guidance on investing public funds. But having said that, do you want that to come from central government when they think HS2 is a good use of money? Whether you like the idea or not is not really relevant. It's just an utterly spiralling timeline and bill that just seems to have no end to it.
Absolutely. Well, that's one thing that you can guarantee with government, that they don't know how to spend money. They're good at getting it in from Joe Public, taxes, everything else, but the capacity to spend it in a useful way is beyond their scope.
Well, we're looking at, when we get to the fiscal statement, we'll see what happens, won't we? But I mean, I would think that all the chatter is around cuts and things like that. What will be cut? How much can you cut? And then, of course, that all feeds again into the across the pond narrative with Doge and what are they doing? How effective are they being? So much propaganda on either side. It's really difficult to tell what's going on if you're just sort of an interested observer like I am. So I think my take on the whole sort of austerity thing when it happened in the previous administration was first couple of rounds, probably needed, probably good. We probably need that again because we've had COVID and things have ballooned in certain departments. Absolutely. Once you get past your second round, you're probably just pushing numbers around on a spreadsheet, or worse than that, you're cutting things now that are going to have a much worse impact in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
And the concern of something like that is this is kind of the way some of the listed companies work. Manage the share price over the next 3 months to 3 years, right? Because that's when the CEO and everybody's bonuses take place. We're not then thinking about, and when you look at big, either private or listed, but who still retain control of their companies, like family built, they tend to not fall into those traps and they do things for the long run. And those are the businesses that last 100 plus years,
Yeah, absolutely. Just very quickly interrupting this episode, have you got a property deal in mind? Want to build or grow your portfolio but unsure how to obtain funding? No problem. At Roma Finance, they love to lend. The borrower-first approach means Roma deliver flexible, tailored solutions that accommodate the diverse needs and experience of developers across residential and commercial projects. With a flexible criteria, Roma take time to understand each borrower's unique circumstances. Roma's attentive team are always equipped to handle and take on your requests. They will guide and support you throughout the property journey. Colleagues and customer relations are the beating heart of their business. Don't forget to explore Roma's website, romafinance.co.uk, for helpful resources, including articles and case studies to guide your financial decisions. Remember, Roma Finance love to lend. Your property goals are only a call or email away. Now back to the episode. So moving away from the economics and government side, moving more towards your career and journey, I guess, in property specifically. Obviously, for people that don't know, just tuned in to they must have been living under a rock if they've not come across you before. But obviously, you've got a portfolio of around about 500 properties.
It's a bit more than that these days. Right. Yeah, so we bought quite a bit when the old, but especially upcoming to the budget last year in 2024. So numbers over 700 these days.
Wow. Yeah. 500, 700, you know. I mean, to go from 1 to 700, what's that process been like?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
So, different, I suppose. There's obviously some sort of milestones that I can, or some key pieces of tactical changes and strategy that made that happen. One of them being sort of intelligent use of bridging finance, taking the right risks at the right time. Another one being a bit belligerent, really, a bit bloody minded. So when 2021, 2022 came, the early part of 22, and prices were just going crazy, it's having the gumption, I suppose, or the stubbornness to say, no, we're not chasing. I know prices are going up. We're not chasing them upwards. This is how things go wrong when you start buying up in a boom, because something's going to happen here. And then sort of beginning of 22, I was starting to get very nervy about where the interest rate was going, purely because from a forecasting perspective, I couldn't see where the ceiling was. And there weren't enough clues from people like the Bank of England. And why not? Because they didn't know. That's the reality of it. Then they started to take a very firm position that the base rate was not going above 6%. There's no way it was going to 6%. No way, no way. And I thought, I heard these sort of, that's reading between the lines, but I'm quite involved. I go to the Bank of England quarterly briefings. I read a lot of the stuff. And I thought, right, okay, so they must know there's some real bombs that go off if we have to hit 6%. So that probably sees mortgage rates topping out at 7%. That's sort of where I got to in 2022. What still works, what doesn't work, what works for new units. Goodness me, you're going to have to be buying stuff with 9-10% yield if that's the case, if you want to use leverage. And if you're not using leverage, I don't know why, because it's tax efficient normally, depending on personal name and Section 24 and everything else. I grant you that. And if you're not thinking that prices are going to go up, it's a difficult game to be in if you're not banking on some significant capital growth over time. So change there in a bit frustrating, but used the time to try and do some bigger deals. So I've historically stayed away from bigger ones because you can burn a lot of money in the run up. It can take a lot of time to get through them. They don't end up being as good as they are. If you're in a rising market the whole time, not a problem, but got involved in some limited company acquisitions and things like that. Started doing a bit of consulting for people who are selling businesses, which I quite enjoyed. So just sort of keeping my ear to the ground, keeping the machine running, because my core machine is pretty lean. So we're not under loads of pressure to buy. We don't have to buy 10 properties a month or the lights go off, you know. And that was this really interesting thing that happened from a sort of strategic perspective when 22 sort of came. It was this realization I had early in the year of our existing business, fine, new business really doesn't look very good. Really doesn't look that good. So what's going to change? And then looking into it, I'd been talking about inflation. Rates are going to go. Actually, where rates are going to go, don't know. What do we do? De-risk, broke a lot of debt, fixed it out to sort of 2027, which really shored up that existing business. And then had to wait for opportunities, really. There's always, different kinds of deals. So if you're going to do things, some of the really cool stuff like vendor financing and things like that, these deals take months and months to pull off. Normally you don't meet someone. It's not like an auction where you just go into the room and say, yeah, can I have a bit of vendor financing, please? There's going to be a process to go through in terms of building trust with the vendor, in terms of all sorts of things to consider, complexities. If there's a company, you've got corporate lawyers involved. Normally it's not a 5-minute. It's not a 5-minute job, generally speaking. Or if you're buying companies super cheap because they're distressed, okay, you might pay £1 for it, but how much money have you got to put in? Because how do you first of all stop the bleeding and then turn it into something profitable? Because that can often be a consideration as well. So I haven't I always have, I love Warren Buffett, and I always try and have his stuff in the back of my mind somewhere, or sometimes at the front of my mind. And he says, well, you sort of trade through all environments, and the best traders, investors that I've ever known, they have traded through all environments and done different things as things have changed. And some of that involves sort of shoring up when you think the market might go down, and some of it involves just making sure you're available to do anything that does come up. But then when this budget came up in 2024, and it's not the budget itself, it was the fear that it created. That's a generational opportunity. That's 14 years, and the press go into this giant overdrive that's just stressing people out. And honestly, negotiating on stuff was a case of listening to what people were saying and going, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. So they were prepared to do deals, which in 2023, a lot of it, they weren't really prepared to accept that prices had come down in 2022, because people take time and they need to see evidence of all of this stuff. So it's been the last 5 years has been really challenging. Anybody who's done well building their business in the last 5 years, you should be ready for anything in the next 5 because, and ultimately, even in the last 15 years, one in 75-year event, sort of debt crisis, meltdown, 2008 sort of event, 1 in 100-year event, pandemic. There aren't too many more apart from a world war. I really don't feel good about saying that, but you can understand why I do. And that again has been, 80 years or whatever, hasn't it? So, but it probably looks very different these days anyway. We already see that it's probably more about cyber and drones than anything else. And is the UK in any clear and present danger, even with friends or not across the pond being a bit, the special relationship not looking that special at the moment? I don't think we are compared to a lot of other places in the world. So there's this kind of weird thing going on where there's a lot of negativity about the UK, tax, people leaving and all the rest of it. Whilst we've got more people wanting to come than we've ever had before by decent scale factor coming into the country. But is that real, or does investment money go, I'm not really sure about Trump because he's a bit volatile, so anything could happen. So am I going to sign off $250 million investment? Because it's all very well sort of being bullish about it, but when it comes down to it, when you get to the CFO's office and it's like, on your head be it, mate, if that's going to happen, and you think, yeah, actually, maybe the UK, which still has the Brexit discount or whatever you want to call it, applied, and the Eurozone doesn't look too clever still. So we're kind of, I think, in the top 2 or 3 places in the world to invest at the moment, not because we're doing so well, but almost by default, and there's a lot of money out there that wants to invest.
Absolutely. How do you sort of filter through all the noise to kind of accumulate your opinion on the market that allows you to make those decisions?
It's a great question. So, not in an arrogant way, I don't tend to look at other people's forecasts before I make my own. So I don't want to be polluted by what other people are saying, because always, obviously, there's people that I respect in the industry who, like you say things without agenda, who are people who've got good track records, and try and think, right, do my own thinking first and then modify. And then once you've got a sort of set of principles, variables that you're looking at, you're then tweaking generally, unless there's a major shock that happens. So that's, a methodology for forecasting well, which I do anyway as part of my business to know where things are going so that I don't make any massive mistakes as far as the sort of broader market is concerned, aside from anything else. So I go to source data a fair bit. So read a lot of reports that people like the Office for National Statistics put out, Bank of England reports. Don't read don't read the one bit they want to pull out in the media. Read what it says, read what their headlines are, and work out why those are the headlines. And then generally read the news just to inform myself of what other people are being told and thinking, rather than to actually inform myself too much. Because it's like, okay, and then when to pick on two, the Guardian over here and the Telegraph are over here, they've got a pretty clear agenda most of the time in what they say. So therefore, people who are in the centre/left side are going to be told and thinking this. People who are on the centre/right side are going to be told and thinking this. And so you get to then understand from vendors you might be talking to or anything like that, what have people been pump primed with before you even enter into a discussion. So that's how I use it, if you like.
Yeah.
And I don't really take too much stalling in any of it, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of noise out there and it's difficult to filter through, but I suppose if you've got that process and it's working, then don't knock it, I guess. And jumping more to like the operational side of, 700 properties, obviously the economic side, making investment decisions is one thing, but then operating a portfolio of that size is another thing. What kind of formulates that sort of process from are you more involved in the sort of front end stuff, investment and, asset management, or how does it sort of look?
Yeah. So investment, financing, deals, deal flow pipelines. Absolutely. That's the bit that I enjoy the most. That's the highest value part, realistically. And so that makes sense that takes up the majority of my time. Operationally, we have an in-house letting agency, but really it does a bit more. So in my group, there is a role called the asset manager who sits above the agency, who basically makes the investment level decisions or the asset level decisions, such as, are we keeping it or are we selling it? For example, is it time to make that extra bedroom? what sort of financing are we using? Those sort of decisions there. And then the operational side, following the process, making sure we're legally compliant, making sure we deliver a good service. That's that side of things. But also I have multiple letting agencies. So that agency in-house can manage stock around the country.
Right.
Used to manage stock in Scotland. We moved away from that because we had a good manager in Scotland and we thought, we're not saving any money. It's hard for the staff to switch law between Scotland and England. There is a bit much more of a difference than England and Wales, for example. So does it make sense? Because this is not necessarily, that agency's making loads of money. It's more about control of the assets and making sure you're delivering that service. So, and then there are some where the agent's bought me a deal, so it stays with that agent. No issue with that. And I say we've got quite a few units in Scotland that are managed by primarily one agent, but there is also a backup in reserve if anybody quits, sells the business, does this, does that, does the other. The more exposure you've got, the more you see that happening left, right, and centre. So you need to think about things like that as well. So I would say operationally, there's a bit more to it. I mean, it's a bit like if you self-manage, I think it's useful for people to understand that distinction between the agent and the asset manager. Because a lot of people who do self-manage think, well, either these days think, well, there's not a lot of margin, so I've got to. Okay, if that's where it is, then fair enough. I would question whether that's the best use of your time and whether you need to repurpose your assets or whether you've got your rent up as high as you need to, or whether you need to change the use of the property perhaps, or the tenant type or whatever. So you've got to think about that. But if they're doing the letting agent's job and the asset manager's job, and a lot of people don't make that distinction, right, then the letting agent's job is likely cheaper per hour rate. It's still important, absolutely. Less skill required. The asset manager's job is much higher value. And if you doing the letting agent's job is stopping you from doing the asset manager's job, that's going to be problematic for your further increasing in. Now, look, this is not necessarily, maybe doesn't feel relevant to people who've got 1, 2, 3 properties just starting out, whatever. But if you understand all the different tasks that there are and who's doing them, usually at the start, like you said, how do you get from 1 to, forget 700, how do you get from 1 to 3? You're doing everything, right? Everything's dependent on you. Things have got to stack up. But on the flip side, you are there, if you're on it, every second of every day. There's no lag in this, that, and the other. Whereas when there's 700, it's like, that is now going to need to happen tomorrow. That wouldn't necessarily happen. You might just get in the car and sort it out yourself. More difficult when you've got multiple things on the go at the same time. So the slippage in terms of sort of operational cash burn is higher in a business like mine, which is why then that leads to, therefore, I must do better deals as much as possible than anybody else, which is why I've spent so much of my time and focus on getting access to good deals.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Hopefully this question makes sense, but what are the kind of fundamental parts that you or people should be considering when they start their own portfolio? Obviously, you've mentioned asset management, investment side, acquiring deals, the operational side. Like what are the kind of building blocks and leverage? Obviously, you mentioned that as well. What else kind of formulates that kind of overview when you're looking at, from a CEO level, let's call it, you're looking at the business, what metrics are being measured?
Yeah, so you've certainly got to be thinking about, so how do you buy deals? Ultimately, you won't get deals unless you're making offers on stuff or you're getting deals across the desk. So that's going to be your sort of first, I sort of first conceptualized this years ago in a strategic framework to say, right, when I looked around at the industry in general, I found that there was a very small number of people who could do lots of deals, and they were real deals, and then quite a few people talking about doing deals and maybe doing the odd one, and then lots and lots of people who wanted deals, but they didn't know how to get them, right? So there was a real big difference in the number of people who were doing all of that. So that's why I focused so much on trying to do deals. But that really, I used to hear people say, I still do hear people say, it's about the deals and the money, right? To an extent, without either of those two, you are in trouble. In theory, without the money, yes, you might be able to do vendor finance, delayed completions, things like that. Sure, you still need some financial savvy to be able to do that, because at some point you're going to need to go to pocket for a mortgage or a this, that, or the other evaluation or whatever. But really, that's not enough, because on the other side, like you said, you've got the optimization and the delivery. So refurbing, if BRR is your thing, it would come in there. But that might be legal work, for example. That might be asset management sort of work. in general, increasing rents, extending leases, stuff like that. And then in the bottom corner, you've then got management overall, right? So that's so you're going to hold an asset for 20-year lifespan, right? Yeah, buying it and doing it up and right and refinancing it. Let's say that takes the whole of the first year. That's 5% of the time you're going to own that asset. Mm-hmm. So the 95% is going to be important. And you either sit and go, well, I'm not going to make much cash flow out of this and kind of give up on that bit, or say, well, actually, if I've got one of these and it makes 400 quid a month in a really vanilla buy-to-let that's been bought well and is in a good yielding location, let's say, well, it means we're going to need to do 10 of those if I want to get to $4,000 a month, doesn't it? So it helps you put things into perspective. And that's why a lot of people early on go, well, but instead I could have one HMO and it could bring me 1,500 quid a month. And it's like, maybe it could, but are your figures for everything realistic? Because I've seen lots and lots of them where that's what it says on the spreadsheet and it's not what's being delivered. Whereas with a sensible allowance for maintenance and things like that, buy-to-let can be a lot closer to stable, far fewer turnovers. You know, the problem with HMO can be if your average tenant stays 6 months, the agent will be doing better than you will out of it. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
What's the end goal for you?
So I have a choice to make, I suppose, exit or stay. And while we're actively growing the portfolio, I don't want to exit. I don't know what I do with my time apart from it and all that knowledge that I've built up, you know. I already do a little bit of consulting. I think as I get older, I'll probably have more appetite to do more of that because I really enjoy that. And it's comparatively easy to add value to other people's businesses that they've already spent all that time and effort building, and you get to see them when they're here, or at least here, and help them sort of step up a level. I do get a lot of satisfaction out of that. So I think some of that in terms of the portfolio, possibly wrap it up into a REIT. A lot of those questions earlier on that I said about institutional nerves around secondary market assets, that's a huge mountain to climb. And I've got some ideas, and I speak to people about that who are in different industries or different sectors on a relatively regular basis, and say, look, I don't want to do that on my own. I think REIT-wise, you know, really you're looking at building something that's got a couple of billion quid worth of assets in. If I'd had that REIT 5 years ago, there's so much I could have done over the last 5 years with money on the table, with people wanting to exit, with all sorts of stuff like that. It could be a really, really good proposition. But I'm not there yet, and I won't be there for a while because you really do need some big money, big money assets. Or I've got to bring people with me, portfolio, landlords, on that journey with me to say, look, do you want to step back? And this is a real shareholder play, not step back to, going back to my previous analogy, not step back to asset manager, because asset manager's still got to do some work. And it can be quite high pressure work, right? It's quite high value work. So you can't really take your eye off the ball. And if you do, you're in trouble. So I'm talking about the step above the asset manager, above the managing director, into the shareholder, the passive shareholder. And as time goes on and limited company becomes the only way forward, which arguably you might say it has been nearly the only way forward, certainly for a portfolio builder or some kind of tax wrapper anyway, for years. As time goes on, there'll be more and more limited companies to acquire and things like that, which could be plugged into a REIT structure. And for anyone who doesn't know, one of the things about a REIT is they don't pay corporation tax. So there's a significant saving there for people who are at a static level. So when we get to the stage where either I get bored of buying or the market says don't buy anymore, right? That would be the time, which would be ideally, and I don't want to do it that day. I want to be 2 years ahead of that point, which is really ambitious because forecasting 6 months in advance is quite hard. Forecasting 2 years in advance is, you know, really, really difficult. You just have to get broader with what you're forecasting. But at the moment, you look, and one of the things I look at is where's the real price of property? And as I say, not getting distracted by the noise compared to what it says in the papers and all the rest of it. But if you adjust for wages, if you adjust for inflation, right, we're not a lot further on. In fact, we're a little bit behind where we were 20 years ago, right? Yeah. So we're not in a bubble territory here. So there's no kind of mad panic to get towards the exit door or stop buying. But when the mania comes, when your 2021s come along, because things happen and they do, and although 1 in 100-year event and all the rest of it, Labour might cut regular. They're talking now the pillars of cuts that they're going to use are going to include cuts in regulation. One of those might well be cuts in mortgage regulation, easier to borrow. What happens when it's easier to borrow? House prices go like that. So pending the spring statement, that could be an interesting time. But what happens when you have a boom, if you're not careful, it leads towards bust territory. So there needs to be an element of stability in all of that. And realistically, the problem, if you like, with big portfolio is you try and sell it easily within 3 months. I mean, you just got no chance in the world. Yeah. You give it away, that'd be fine. No problem. You have people queuing up at the door. That's not an issue. But if you want to dispose, you either dispose at 100% of value by selling things off individually, which is still costly, especially if they've got to be vacant. At the moment, there's a lot less demand for tenanted generally than there is for stuff that's vacant. So make it vacant. You don't just click your fingers, do you? And renters' rights is going to change that even more. So you're talking with some of the cheaper stock that we have, you might spend 10% of the sale price on getting it vacant. So actually, there needs to be I think something needs to exist between the sort of advertised 80 pence in the pound that a lot of the traders will give, which probably a little bit of smoke and mirrors in that 80 pence price, and 100% open market. And there's a huge blue ocean there for solutions to come into play, one of which would be a REIT. So if anyone's listening and is interested in talking about that any further or has got any experience, because I've never been an investment banker, I've never been in that world, I'd love to speak to them.
Absolutely. Hopefully, fingers crossed, someone is listening. What bit of advice then would you give to, a general bit of advice to property investors that are, in the market at the moment? What sort of key things are you kind of seeing happening? Where do you think the market's going to go? What can sort of people, without obviously giving advice?
Yeah. Well, it's very clear from the listings data that there's so much more stuff on the market than there has been. So 2024 was the biggest year for listing for possibly a decade or so. Now, 2025 is bigger than 2024. And no one seems to want to go and talk about this. It has just about started to appear in the press, in the industry press, in the very niche articles, sort of things that I read, to say, well, actually, it's all the landlords exiting. It's like, no kidding, because where else has all of this stock come from? You can argue there's a bit of a build-up from a 2023 when no one wants to put stuff on the market because they're worried the market's going down. Took 2024 to heal that. But you don't just, as we said, we're not building loads of houses. So it's not that there's loads more houses to go on the market. It is, there are people exiting. And if you dig into that data, you can see sort of geographically where it is, what it is, and leaving big rental shortages in the south and east. But affordability, as discussed earlier, is sort of causing a problem. So the tired landlord thing, it's often used as a hook, isn't it, for people who are going to buy courses on rent to rent or stuff like that. But there are more tired landlords out there at the moment than there have been for a long time, who've adjusted their expectations from a 2022 where everything's flying, and are thinking, actually, as usual, the fear of the event is worse than the event itself. So the Renters' Rights Bill, what's going to happen? Well, actually, quite a bit of this stuff's already been implemented in Scotland. Go and look at what's happened. It was implemented in 2017, quite a bit of it. So I can tell you the Scottish rental market doesn't function terribly differently from the English rental market. So most of it is once again, is noise. So I think you've got to hold hard and think for yourself, not get too what you've got to stay informed, So I would say do that by reading the supplement, but of course I would because I write it or listening to it. That'd be great. But you've got to be quite resilient. Definitely got to be quite resilient and got to continue being quite resilient. Take your opportunities. Don't jump at opportunities. There's no need to listen to this and be a motivated buyer. There's no need to buy anything tomorrow. You haven't got to worry or hurry. And if you've put yourself in a position where you feel like you have got to worry or hurry, try and unwind that position. Don't take money that you're not ready to deploy would be the ideal if you're borrowing money in from investors or however you're structuring your purchases. Compliance process, all the rest of that is going to be more and more important. So don't neglect how important that is. But the funny thing about that side of things is you can get good people who can do that for you at a relatively low price, especially if your time is worth a lot more doing something else, which it inevitably It inevitably is. And don't discount sort of creative strategies very much so at the moment. Lots of people have got, it's a bit like, when you first, or certainly when I first read or heard about 25% BMV, I just thought, it's just a lie, isn't it? I mean, why would anybody do that? But that's not being able to put yourself in other people's shoes and not understanding those positions. Mm-hmm. So take a bit of time to understand what people are getting fed by them via the media, generally speaking, what their concerns are, what their worries are, and how you can help solve them. Because being able to go forward in this game is about solving problems.
Absolutely.
That's all it boils down to.
Yeah, absolutely. So to round this episode off very nicely, it can be a life lesson or property lesson, but what is one of the key lessons that you've learned in your career to date?
So I think it would definitely be my favourite phrase, and it comes up when, I was thinking about this before the budget specifically. Be greedy only when others are fearful, right? Warren Buffett, Again, already mentioned him. But the key bit in that for me actually is only. So don't be greedy in other times. So your 2021's when the market's racing away, but you've got dead cheap money, bounce back loans, this, that, or the other, whatever, or you've got people willing to lend at low rates. The market's roaring, well, it's not really the time you want to be getting stuck into stuff. Doesn't mean there weren't deals done. We still did deals, 2021, but there were fewer and further between, right? Whereas pre-budget, when it was like, here's the fear, what's the reality look like? It's not going to be as bad as the fear. Even if it had been worse than it was, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as bad as what people were saying to me was going to happen, that they'd already decided for themselves. That's when to pounce. So put yourself in a position where you can be, and ideally try and stay lean as much as possible. Big overheads in this game can be really, really difficult. So, solid cash flow management one way or another, but I don't like businesses with big overheads because they can be, very, very, you have to be very flexible sometimes. That means letting people go. It's hard to get good people in, so you don't want to let them go. B, it puts you under an unreasonable amount of pressure, really, I think. So there's more than one little bit there, isn't there? But that'll probably do.
Definitely something to unpick there for sure. So if people want to find out more about the supplement that you mentioned, obviously that, for people that have never heard about the supplement, obviously that is your take on the week. You do them weekly, don't you?
I do. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
They're so informative. I read some of them, not all of them, because they are very intense.
I don't blame you.
But if people want to find out how they can subscribe to that or get more information around that, how can they go about that?
So for the reason that it is so dense and intense, like you say, I do a recorded version on my YouTube, which is Propenomix, so property and economics mashed together, Propenomix with Adam Lawrence. I do a written version as well that goes on the Partners in Property blog and also goes on my LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is the platform I'm vastly more active on social media because it's more business focused and I'm much more business focused. So subscribe to the newsletter on LinkedIn, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Always enjoy hearing people's thoughts. If people leave comments and things like that, I always try and get back to them. It's a bit easier on there than through the other platforms because it can be a bit of a morass of noise of your Facebooks and your Instas and all the rest of it. So if you want to try and get in touch, it's worth doing on those platforms.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for coming on for the 50th episode. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to put the hat on.
For the credits. Well. Yeah. Amazing. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
No problem. So hopefully you've had some very good insights to the property market, what's to come, some good key lessons from Adam. If you really do want to get the next level of in-depth information, then it really is worth keeping up to date with the supplement. They are amazing. Lots of insights on there. We'll put the details in the show notes. As I always say, please do like and subscribe and leave a review. It helps the podcast. I'll see you again soon. Take care. All the best.